We're going to focus now on the state of the labor market. I think there are a lot of questions for a bunch of reasons. We're really lucky to have Svenja Gudell, who is the chief economist at Indeed, who is going to walk us through. Svenja has worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. She was the chief economist at Zillow. So if you have real estate questions, you can ask her during the coffee break. And she oversees at Indeed the Hiring Lab, which is a really important source of data that looks at both Indeed's proprietary data from their own platform, but also publicly available data. And we're particularly, Svenja is really in demand these days, in part because of the issues with U.S. government employment data because of the federal shutdown and because of the political pressures on the government data sources. And so we thought we would spend a little bit of time just to kind of level set on the state of the market for you all as you go into planning for 2026. So Svenja, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me
today. And
pleasure to be here.
So first of all, I wanted to start by asking what labor market indicators matter most right now, and what are they telling us about the direction that we're headed in?
All of them.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think there's a lot going on right now. So we're looking at a lot of different data points. One of the most important things we're watching out for, if the labor market is on shakier legs these days, and will that kind of bleed into the overall economy, right? And so one of the things we're watching closely is, even though we've seen demand for labor come down via our job postings, over like the silver lining has been that layoffs have been relatively low, right? And unemployment, even though it's starting to inch up, is also still relatively low, right,
Yeah.
compared to historical levels. It's going to get really interesting once we start to see some of the negative sentiment show up more in the data on the layoff and unemployment side. And then we think it's going to impact consumption, and that overall will impact heavily what we see on the GDP side, of course, and the overall performance of the economy. So those are like the headline things we watch out for.
And these are the Federal Reserve is among those who's watching this question that you started with, is whether the job market will impact the broader economy, the state of jobs.
Right.
There are a bunch of like different factors. There's the tariffs, there's the sharp immigration fall off, there's AI. How is it shaping employer behavior?
It's a really interesting time to analyze all this because there's so many factors, as you mentioned, that are colliding, right? And so from an employer perspective, I think we're seeing unprecedented levels of uncertainty and having to navigate that, right? And just as the previous panel mentioned, right, your ability to plan into the future has been significantly impacted. And so from an employer standpoint, you not only have to figure out, okay, what are the tariffs going to be? Where am I going to get my labor, particularly in sectors that are heavy users of immigration talent? How am I going to integrate AI, and what are the skills I should hire for tomorrow? All of that, I think, taking all of that into consideration, it makes a lot of sense to think about baby steps forward, seeing what you can do, and of course, not giving up on the human. We're still seeing the human is incredibly important in all of this, right? So hiring for the very human skills that are necessary for tomorrow.
What are those human skills that are necessary for tomorrow? This is a question that
yes.
many of us have and think about for our children as well.
Problem-solving abilities, cross-team collaboration and communication, empathy, leadership. We're seeing in some pockets of the labor market, the requirement for experience has gone up because you, of course, integrating a lot of AI tools means that you oversee a lot of processes, right? You have to actually figure out, how am I going to integrate this tool? How can I use AI as a force multiplier? And that does take a little bit of experience and know-how. So we're seeing some of those things show up in job descriptions and what.
And we're also seeing the in terms of AI, you've just done a bunch of research on how AI is impacting the skills, and actually what you found. Can maybe share what you found, which is that we're still pretty early, right?
It's early days. The number one takeaway is that economists will never go away, much like lawyers. Will be around forever.
How about
no.
journalists?
Looking
Okay.
a little sketchier on that.
There's a lot to ask. Okay.
No, Kevin. Journalism is very important.
Okay. Thank you.
But our research found that all jobs will be impacted by AI. There's literally no single job out there that won't, to some degree, be impacted by AI.
And your analysis was skill by skill for each
The way
job,
we did it is we looked at how AI would impact individual skills, and then, of course, a job is a collection of skills.
Yeah.
So given how many skills are impacted by AI, that collection of skills, you find that in every single job out there, to some lower or higher extent. But we also found that there's not a single job that can be fully done by AI. So you need the human oversight. Although we have done research 3 years in a row now on how AI will impact the labor market. And in that research, we've actually seen how much better AI has gotten over time. So now there are 30 skills that can be fully done by AI without human supervision. So that's kind of cool too.
I want to talk about other sort of job categories and sectors you're looking at, but just in terms of one area that I think there's a lot of focus in particularly in the context of AI, is early career workers. And Joe Fuller from Harvard's going to talk about that more later. But are you seeing anything in your data on that?
Certainly, of course, if you're following unemployment rates, youth unemployment has really shot up. And part of that has to do with just where we find ourselves in the economic cycle, right? We, as I mentioned, our job postings data shows that demand for labor has gone down significantly. Instead of there being 2 jobs for every unemployed person, there's now 1 job for every unemployed person. And so less demand translates to less demand for entry-level workers and internships and all these other more early career type roles. And sometimes in some sectors even more so than before, because particularly in tech we're seeing a call for a lot of jobs that require more experience and less so, kind of like the entry-level type position, which makes sense. We think this is the early onset of AI really showing up, which, mind you, isn't happening in a lot of other sectors. So tech is at the forefront of seeing an impact here, where you really, particularly generative AI tends to be fairly good at coding or helping people code. So you can imagine some of these skills particularly needed in an entry-level type position are partially at least done by Gen AI, which means you're going to need fewer entry-level workers in tech. That's not happening in other sectors, though. So it's a tech phenomenon. It's
a tech phenomenon that's magnified by the supply of labor actually looking for jobs as well. And so employers have the opportunity to just up the experience requirements because they have more and more people to choose from. Right?
Certainly, the bargaining power has definitely swung over to employers more. And you can see a little bit of that just particularly in tech. I don't know if you've seen like the 996, right? Work 9 to 9, 6 days a week. You have to be all bought in. I'm not saying that's a general trend, but we're seeing some of those mentions pop up a lot more now than 2-3 years ago.
Just to step back on the economic data, the jobs data climate, with the issues with federal data, are there things that you're seeing in your own data that actually people may not be realizing, may not be seeing more broadly at a moment when our ability to look into the job market is actually particularly cloudy?
We've been a lot busier than we usually are, so we're fielding a lot more questions. And one of the really, I think, unique aspects of Indeed data at this time is that we're seeing real-time insights, right? So we have. If you think about it, we see the demand side of the market via job postings and everything that employers are kind of actioning on their side. And then we see the supply side of the markets, everything around profiles, right, resumes of job seekers and their actions on our site. And then we see how those come together so we can see what wages we're doing and all these things. So it's a really fascinating view. And every time we run our analysis, we have all the data in there. So we can look at yesterday's full day, and we don't have to wait 2 months for that data to be updated. So it's a really nice full-time view. And on top of that, I'll say we have millions of job postings and millions of job seekers on Indeed. So that level of insight lets us dig really deep, right? You can cut that data very finely, so you can dive very deeply into different sectors and see what's going on, which I think is fairly unique as well.
And are there specific sectors or jobs that you're looking at closely in the context of some of the macro trends that we talked about?
Definitely. Tech is always a good one just to kind of see early days for the AI impacts. Healthcare, huge sector, and I think we'll need more and more as we have an aging population, so we're paying very close attention there. And otherwise, we really try to dig into job postings for different sectors to see how these jobs are starting to change, right? Because there's this evolution that, it's almost simplistic to always talk about, well, some jobs will go away and we'll create new jobs, where it's more than that. Every single job will kind of change in and of itself. Like the tasks and skills that you need to perform that particular job will change. Just like a software, back in the day, remember you had to carry those little cards to the library to like get the punching thing.
Punch cards?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't use those.
I didn't either, for the
I've
record.
heard stories. So that job looked very different, right? Yeah. And so I expect a software developer to look very different in 2 years. It's already changing rapidly today. Yeah. So being able to see those changes real time is fascinating, and I think one of the unique aspects of the data.
And one thing when I'm hearing you, one thing that you're saying is that, for example, like the number of job listings that actually have AI skills requirements is actually really very low right now. And so while we're talking a lot about AI, the reality that you're seeing in your data are that actuwe most jobs don't require it at the very least.
Not yet.
The other thing that is really very striking is we know we have this frozen labor market. There's in some ways there's an oversupply of labor. The experience of people in the job market is it takes forever to actually get jobs for a lot of the time. But we actually expect shortages in some types of roles for labor. So what are some of the categories with the reduction of immigration and other things where you expect to see acute shortages of labor moving forward?
Yeah, just worth mentioning kind of to set it all up, right? If you take a step back, we're seeing that labor force participation has already peaked and we're starting to come down. So the share of workers of the overall population is starting to cut back. And that's causing some of these labor shortages because our immigration policy right now is heavily impacting the talent pool that we have available. So first thing, we're looking at industries that are heavily using oftentimes immigrant labor. So you're talking construction, agriculture, healthcare, and there we are seeing pockets of shortages. So if I talk to an employer in healthcare, they're telling me, I'm still having a hard time finding nurses. I'm having a hard time hiring a physician or a surgeon. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because it does show up in the data. The number of job postings that are now offering assistance for visa sponsorship or green cards has spiked. Wow.
Counterintuitively, yeah.
Exactly. So employers are still being fairly creative in terms of how they're trying to access different talent pools. And then we're also seeing signing bonuses, particularly in healthcare, still quite elevated, which is interesting, right? If you would look at the labor market as a whole right now, you wouldn't be like, yes, everyone needs to have a signing bonus, right? It's really these pockets where you're finding this in. And it just comes to show that the labor market, is moving at varying speeds right now, and different sectors are acting very differently, which is quite different than what it was even 4 years ago. The tide was lifting all boats, and now everyone's kind of.
You're an AI scientist or a healthcare worker. So I have a last question for you. So you've talked about the uncertainty in the labor market. If you are having to make people, talent planning, talent strategy decisions into 2026, as a number of people in this room are having to do right now or shortly, what's your advice to them in terms of making those decisions in light of the cloudiness of the data?
All the stuff that's going on right now?
Yeah.
I would hire people that are willing to experiment. I mean, that's one of the big things I think that's really important. Experiment particularly on AI, right? How can you integrate these tools? How can you harness some of that productivity impact? Because we won't see any of that until we see more adoption, right? And given that adoption is so low, I think that experimentation phase is really important. Hire for transferable skills, right? Because I think we're all going to be lifelong learners from here on out, even more so than we were 10 years ago. And so being able to learn and pick up these different skills is really important. And I think hiring for that is super important. So being in a growth mindset, being able to problem solve, like we talked a little bit about already, having some of these skills, I think, will be really good. And then, of course, taking a step forward, because it's easy to think, okay, everything's frozen, I'm just going to sit here, and that's obviously hard to do over time. So at some point, you just kind of
you just actually have to move. And also, in some areas, for some people, there are actually and will be shortages of labor. And so they've got to actually be collecting talent right now as that's coming.
Well, and I think, particularly in some of these areas where it makes sense, this is less makes sense for a nurse, but remote work, even though it's, we're all calling people back to the office, sometimes I'm surprised, given that we are facing labor shortages in some areas. Remote work, I think, is still a really useful tool
to attract talent.
To attract talent, right? And widening your talent pool overall.
Svenja, thank you for this. Svenja Gudell, the Chief Economist of Indeed. We appreciate it. We'll stay in touch with you.